On November 24th, 1971, a gloomy afternoon in Portland, Oregon, a mysterious man dressed neatly in a dark suit quietly boarded Northwest Orient, Flight 305. He ordered a bourbon with soda, sitting calmly like any other businessman, but just minutes later, a small note, handed to the flight attendant, changed the course of American aviation history. "I have a bomb in my briefcase." From that moment, the man known as D.B. Cooper began an unimaginable heist, demanding ransom money, parachutes, and then leaping into the stormy night sky from thousands of feet above. The shocking part: after that daring jump, Cooper vanished without a trace. No one knows whether he survived or perished. And the FBI, despite launching the largest manhunt of its time, was left empty-handed. This was not just a crime, but a living legend, one that has endured for over half a century, baffling investigators, fueling endless theories, and securing its place as one of America's most captivating mysteries. 1. The mysterious man boards the plane. November 24th, 1971, Portland International Airport bustled with the noise of travelers preparing to head home for Thanksgiving. Families hurried to their gates, children clutched toys, businessmen carried briefcases, and the loudspeaker called out boarding announcements in a steady rhythm. The holiday rush was in full swing. In the middle of this crowd moved a man who, at first glance, seemed utterly ordinary. He was tall, around 6 feet, with neatly combed dark hair, a crisp white shirt, a black tie, and a well-fitted dark suit. Nothing about him stood out, and that was exactly the point. He blended seamlessly into the sea of passengers, the kind of man you would forget the moment you looked away. Approaching the counter, he paid $20 cash for a one-way ticket to Seattle. The name he scribbled on the ticket: Dan Cooper. The agent barely looked up, accustomed to countless such transactions during the holiday rush. In that brief exchange, history had just shifted, but no one knew it yet. Moments later, Cooper walked calmly down the jet bridge toward Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a short 30-minute hop to Seattle. The aircraft, a Boeing 727, was already buzzing with passengers settling in. He offered a polite nod to the flight attendant as he boarded, his presence so unremarkable that no one gave him a second glance. Sliding into seat 18C, located toward the rear of the cabin, Cooper set his briefcase neatly beside him. He loosened his tie slightly, exhaled, and gave the impression of a man accustomed to business travel. When the stewardess passed by, he ordered a bourbon and soda, sparking up a cigarette with steady hands. The smoke curled lazily into the cabin air, a normal sight in 1971 when smoking was permitted on board. To every casual observer, he was just another businessman taking a routine evening flight. The cabin lights glowed softly, passengers read their newspapers, and the hum of the engines was a lullaby of normalcy. No one could have guessed that within the next hour, this quiet man in a dark suit would transform an ordinary holiday flight into the most legendary aviation mystery in American history. 2. The fateful note. Northwest Orient Flight 305, a Boeing 727, lifted off from Portland at 2:50 p.m. On board were 36 passengers and 6 crew members. For most, it was just a routine 30-minute flight to Seattle. In seat 18C, near the rear of the cabin, Cooper settled in quietly. He loosened his tie, ordered a bourbon and soda, and lit a cigarette. He gazed out the window as the plane climbed above the overcast sky, his calmness almost unnerving to the flight attendant who served him. A few minutes later, he handed Florence Schaffner, one of the stewardesses, a small folded note. Florence hardly glanced at it, assuming it was just a phone number from a lonely passenger. She slipped it into her pocket without reading. But then Cooper leaned closer, His voice was low, steady, without a hint of emotion. "Miss, you'd better read it. I have a bomb." Florence froze. Her heartbeat hammered in her chest. Slowly, she unfolded the note. Written in neat block letters were chilling words. "I have a bomb in my briefcase. Sit beside me. This plane is under my control." Her hands trembled as she looked up. Cooper's face was calm, expressionless. No smirk, no anger, just cold certainty. He quietly opened his attaché case, tilting it just enough for her to see. 8 red cylinders wired to a battery, bundles of wire carefully arranged. Then he snapped it shut. Florence forced herself to remain composed, masking the fear threatening to break through. With practiced professionalism, she slid into the seat beside him. Tension in the cabin. The cockpit was informed discreetly. Inside, Captain William Scott, First Officer William Ratazak, and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson grasped the reality in an instant. The plane was hijacked. Every life on board now hung on the decisions of one calm, methodical stranger. Back in the cabin, the other passengers laughed, read magazines, and sipped drinks, blissfully unaware that a hijacking was unfolding just a few feet away. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and bourbon, the illusion of normalcy unbroken. Cooper laid out his demands in a voice that was polite, but unyielding. $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, 2 main, 2 reserve. A fuel truck ready in Seattle for refueling. He never raised his voice, never displayed panic or aggression. He spoke with the composure of someone who had rehearsed every word. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who later interacted with him most, would recall that his courtesy was unsettling, that his calmness made him more frightening than anger ever could. Landing in the shadows, by 5:45 p.m., Flight 305 began its descent into Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Outside, rain lashed against the fuselage, and the November sky had already turned dark. Cooper instructed the pilots to keep the runway lights dim, to have emergency vehicles keep their distance. He wanted no surprises. The passengers were told only that the plane had a minor mechanical delay. They filed off quietly after landing, relieved to stretch their legs, unaware they had just walked away from a hijacking. On the tarmac, a truck arrived carrying a canvas sack stuffed with $200,000 in $20 bills, serial numbers carefully recorded by the FBI. Alongside it were 4 parachutes. Cooper checked the bag methodically, nodded, and allowed the passengers to disembark. He kept only the crew on board, his leverage, his witnesses. The aircraft was refueled. No one had been hurt. No shots had been fired. Yet a storm of tension still hovered inside the plane. The leap into darkness. At 7:40 p.m., Cooper issued his next command. The plane was to take off again, this time bound for Mexico City. His instructions were precise, almost professional. Maintain 10,000 feet altitude, keep airspeed at around 170 knots, fly with the landing gear down, keep the cabin unpressurized, and crucially, unlock the rear stairway of the Boeing 727. The pilots exchanged uneasy glances. These were not the demands of an amateur. Whoever he was, Cooper seemed to know the Boeing 727's unique design intimately. As the jet climbed into the stormy night, the crew braced themselves. Her rain pelted the metal skin of the aircraft, turbulence shook the cabin, and gusts of wind howled through the sky. The Boeing 727 pushed forward like a lone ghost in the storm. At 8:13 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit. The rear stairway had been deployed mid-flight. The plane's tail jolted, the cabin rattled violently, and a rush of freezing air roared inside. Somewhere behind them, in that icy darkness, D.B. Cooper prepared for his final act. Strapping on one of the parachutes, securing the heavy sack of cash to his body, he stood at the open stairway. The night was pitch black, rain slashing across his face, winds threatening to tear him apart. Below stretched endless forest, rivers, and mountains of the Pacific Northwest, a wilderness both vast and merciless. And then, without hesitation, he jumped. The Boeing 727 stabilized as the weight vanished from the stairway. The crew, still strapped in their seats, exchanged glances heavy with disbelief. Cooper was gone, swallowed by storm and night. That was the last confirmed sighting of D.B. Cooper. His figure, vanishing into the void with $200,000, would ignite a half-century of speculation, investigation, and legend. 3. The largest manhunt in FBI history. That stormy night in November 1971, after Cooper's daring leap into darkness, Northwest Flight 305 eventually touched down in Reno, Nevada. The pilots followed his instructions precisely. Low altitude, slow speed, rear stairs lowered until the very last minute. When the wheels finally screeched against the runway, there was a collective sigh of relief from the crew. The Boeing 727 rolled to a stop. Police vehicles and FBI agents rushed to surround it, weapons ready, floodlights cutting through the night rain. But when they stormed the plane, they found only the 5 exhausted crew members, shaken but unharmed. Cooper was gone, the money was gone, and with him, any trace of certainty. It was as if the man had been swallowed whole by the storm. Within hours, the FBI launched a massive investigation. The case was given a code name that would echo for decades: Norjack, Northwest Hijacking. This was no ordinary manhunt. It quickly became the most extensive and expensive investigation in the Bureau's history. Over 1,000 military personnel, law enforcement officers, and volunteers scoured the dense forests of Washington state. Helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft circled the skies, braving the same winds that Cooper had jumped into. Tracking dogs were unleashed, noses pressed to the damp earth, searching for even the faintest trail. Rivers were dredged, lakes drained, ravines inspected inch by inch. For weeks, the wilderness was torn apart by search teams. Every log, every hollow, every riverbank was examined. Yet there was nothing. No parachute, no briefcase, no footprints, no body. The Pacific Northwest, with its endless miles of evergreen forests, icy rivers, and rugged terrain, seemed to have swallowed Cooper whole. Scant clues. For investigators, the absence of evidence was maddening. All they had were a few fragments, tiny whispers of a man who had otherwise vanished like smoke, a few latent fingerprints on Cooper's seat and his glass of bourbon, a black clip-on tie left draped neatly on his seat-back tray, its cheap fabric now an object of endless scrutiny. Witness descriptions: a man in his mid-40s, about 6 feet tall, dark hair, brown eyes, calm, polite, utterly composed. That was all. Nearly a decade later, in February 1980, a young boy digging along the Columbia River stumbled upon something strange. A bundle of rotting $20 bills, partially buried in the sand. In total, there were $5,800 in decayed currency. When the serial numbers were checked, they matched the ransom money. The find reignited public fascination, but it only deepened the mystery. How had the money ended up there? Was it carried by the river from Cooper's landing site? Had he buried it himself? Or was it a deliberate red herring, planted to mislead? Aside from that single discovery, the rest of the $200,000 simply vanished, absorbed, it seemed, into thin air. The FBI's failure. For decades, the FBI chased lead after lead. Thousands of tips poured in from the public. Hundreds of suspects were investigated: ex-paratroopers, missing fugitives, troubled war veterans, even ordinary men who bragged drunkenly in bars about being Cooper. Some suspects looked promising. Some even confessed. But every time the evidence collapsed. The ransom bills never resurfaced, the parachutes were never found, the briefcase never turned up. It was as if Cooper had jumped not just into a storm, but into another world entirely. Theories spread like wildfire. Did he die in the freezing night sky, his body shattered in the mountains and devoured by the wilderness? Or did he survive, limping through the woods to safety, blending back into society with a quiet smile, a false name, and a secret fortune? Year after year, the FBI followed every thread, no matter how thin. The case consumed time, manpower, and millions of dollars. Yet each lead ended the same way: cold, lifeless, unresolved. Finally, in July 2016, after 45 years, the Bureau announced that the Norjack investigation was officially closed. The case file would remain open in theory, but active pursuit had ended. It was a stunning admission. The FBI, with all its power, had failed, a legend that would not die. And so, Flight 305 remains unique in American history, the only unsolved case of air piracy. The hijacker who leapt into a stormy night with $200,000 in cash simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the law. But in the eyes of the public, he became something else. A legend. The name D.B. Cooper endures, not chained in a prison cell, not marked by a gravestone, but as a symbol of mystery itself. A faceless figure who outwitted the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world, then vanished into the rain. He is remembered not only as a criminal, but as an enigma, an American ghost story. A man who walked onto a plane, handed over a note, and disappeared into history. 4. Clues and later discoveries. The decaying treasure by the Columbia River. Nearly a decade had passed since the night D.B. Cooper vanished into the storm. For years, the forests and rivers of the Pacific Northwest had been searched in vain. Then, in February 1980, fate intervened. On a chilly afternoon, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was camping with his family on a sandy stretch along the Columbia River near Tennebar, Washington. While digging in the sand to build a fire pit, his fingers struck something unusual, small bundles wrapped in rubber bands. At first it looked like old trash, but as his parents leaned closer, their eyes widened. The bundles contained rotting, waterlogged $20 bills. The total came to $5,800. The notes were faded, brittle, clumped together by sand and time. When the FBI examined them, the discovery sent shockwaves across the country. The serial numbers were an exact match with the ransom money handed to D.B. Cooper on that rainy night in Seattle, 1971. The find reignited national obsession. Theories erupted like wildfire. Had Cooper perished in the jump, his body lost in the woods, while the cash slowly washed downstream to the Columbia? Or had he buried the money deliberately, intending to return, but never did? Perhaps someone else stumbled upon the bundles and discarded them, leaving only this strange fragment for posterity. Yet the biggest question remained: why only $5,800 of the $200,000? The vast bulk of the ransom, nearly $200,000, was still unaccounted for, like a ghost swallowed by time. The parachute and the vanishing briefcase. Among the 4 parachutes provided to Cooper that night, one had been a dummy, a training chute that could never deploy. Cooper had inspected them carefully and rejected it, choosing the others. But debate lingered for decades. If he was an expert, why hadn't he recognized the training chute instantly? If he was a novice, how did he know enough to avoid using it? Or did he recognize it all along and intentionally discard it? A quiet nod to his own skill and confidence. And then there was the black attaché case. The one Cooper claimed contained a bomb. When he cracked it open on the plane, flight attendant Florence Schaffner had seen the red cylinders, wires, and batteries. But after his jump into the storm, the briefcase vanished completely. Some experts believed it was never real, just a carefully constructed mock device designed to terrify. Others insisted that without it, the truth could never be proven. Was it a genuine explosive, or simply a magician's prop in one of the greatest disappearing acts of the century? Scattered puzzle pieces. From the 1970s through the early 2000s, rumors of new clues occasionally surfaced, each one sparking headlines, only to fizzle into disappointment. A torn parachute, tangled in the treetops, reported by hikers, gone by the time investigators arrived. Human remains discovered in the wilderness, quickly ruled out by forensic testing. Old $20 bills turning up in circulation, none of which matched the FBI's carefully recorded serial numbers. Every fragment seemed to lead nowhere, leaving only frustration. It was as if Cooper himself had left behind a puzzle designed not to be solved, each piece scattered across time like breadcrumbs that led only to dead ends. The money in the sand, the missing briefcase, the parachutes. The endless rumors, none offered resolution, only deeper uncertainty. The legend of D.B. Cooper grew not from answers, but from the haunting absence of them. 5. Hundreds of suspects across the decades. For nearly 50 years, the hunt for D.B. Cooper dragged investigators down countless paths. The FBI compiled a list of more than 800 potential suspects, ranging from ex-military men to petty criminals, from drifters to airline employees. Each new lead sparked headlines, and for a moment, the world would lean forward in anticipation. Had Cooper finally been found? But time and again, the answers slipped away. Richard Floyd McCoy, the copycat hijacker, April 1972. Less than 5 months after Cooper's leap into the storm, a man hijacked another Boeing 727, demanded a ransom of $500,000, and parachuted into the night sky. His name was Richard Floyd McCoy, a decorated Vietnam veteran, skilled helicopter pilot, and avid skydiver. The similarities to Cooper's crime were uncanny. McCoy's calm demeanor, military background, and familiarity with parachutes made him a natural suspect. Some investigators and many journalists were convinced McCoy must have been Cooper all along, striking again. But the FBI quickly poured cold water on the theory. Eyewitnesses from Flight 305, who had seen Cooper up close, rejected McCoy as a match. McCoy's alibi was airtight. He was in Utah on the night of November 24, 1971. Even so, conspiracy theories refused to die. McCoy was later convicted of his own hijacking and sentenced to 45 years in prison. In 1974, he escaped, only to be killed in a gunfight with the FBI. With his death, the Bureau closed the book on any McCoy-Cooper connection. But for many, the similarities were too eerie to dismiss. Kenneth Christensen, the airline insider. In 2003, more than 3 decades after the hijacking, a new suspect entered the spotlight, Kenneth Christensen. The tip came from a woman who claimed Christensen had once confessed his secret to her. The story was tantalizing. Christensen had worked as a flight attendant and mechanic for Northwest Orient Airlines, the very airline Cooper had hijacked. He was familiar with the Boeing 727's unique rear stairway, the very escape route Cooper used. He also had a passion for skydiving, and after 1971, suddenly appeared to have enough money to buy land and property. To many armchair detectives, the puzzle pieces fit neatly. Christensen was older than the FBI's initial age range, but bore a striking resemblance to some of the sketches. Documentaries and books soon proclaimed him the most likely Cooper. Yet once again, the FBI dismissed the claim. Christensen's physical features didn't perfectly match. and no fingerprints, DNA, or other evidence tied him to the hijacking. For the Bureau, case closed. For the public, suspicion lingered. Dwayne Webber, the deathbed confession. In the quiet of a Florida hospital, a man named Dwayne Webber lay dying. With his last breaths, he turned to his wife and whispered, "I'm Dan Cooper." The confession shocked her. After his death, she began recalling peculiar details. Webber had a history of petty crimes and forgery. He often woke up from nightmares, muttering about forests and leaping from planes. She discovered an old notebook where the name D.B. Cooper was scribbled. For a moment, the story caught fire. Could a dying man have unburdened himself of America's greatest mystery? But when the FBI compared Webber's fingerprints and DNA to the evidence from the hijacking, the results were negative. Another lead, another dead end. A forest of other suspects. Over the decades, the suspect pool grew almost surreal. The names ranged from the mundane to the bizarre. Military deserters who vanished after 1971, convicts who bragged in bars about being Cooper, reclusive drifters who fit the age and build, even notorious mobsters and criminal masterminds rumored to have funded the crime. Each time, the FBI dug in, and each time, the evidence crumbled. One eccentric suspect, a recluse in the Pacific Northwest, became the subject of local legend. He was secretive, lived off the grid, and was spotted carrying wads of cash. Yet when agents closed in, nothing tied him to the case. Another was a transgender woman who claimed she had been Cooper before transitioning. That too dissolved under scrutiny. The suspect list was endless. The answers non-existent. Why were they all eliminated? The reasons were painfully clear. Lack of physical evidence, beyond a few partial fingerprints, a discarded clip-on tie, and in the recovered money in 1980, Cooper had left nothing tangible behind. Time, witnesses aged, memories blurred, and any trace that might have existed in 1971 had long since decayed. The possibility of death. If Cooper had perished in his daring leap, his body and parachute could have been swallowed by the wilderness, leaving investigators chasing a ghost, the phantom outlaw. And so, hundreds of names rose and fell under suspicion. Each time the FBI cleared a suspect, the mystery only deepened. D.B. Cooper was never unmasked. Instead, he transformed into something more than a man. He became a phantom outlaw, a trickster who had mocked the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world and slipped away without a trace. Every cleared suspect fed the legend. And today, Cooper is remembered not for the evidence that proved him real, but for the questions that kept him myth. 6. The impact on aviation security. The mysterious rear staircase and the Cooper vein, the hijacking of Northwest Orient Flight 305, exposed a vulnerability in aircraft design that no one had seriously considered before. The Boeing 727, unlike most commercial jets of its time, was equipped with a rear air stair that could be lowered during flight. What had been conceived as a convenient boarding feature suddenly became a perfect escape hatch for a determined hijacker. On that stormy night in 1971, D.B. Cooper demonstrated its flaw to the world. He opened the stairway at altitude, strapped on a parachute, and simply disappeared into the night. The boldness of that maneuver stunned both the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. They realized that unless this loophole was closed, any copycat criminal could replicate the feat. Engineers were tasked with finding a solution, and they came up with an elegant device that became known as the Cooper vein. This simple but ingenious mechanism relied on the natural flow of air. At cruising speed, The vane swung into position and locked the rear stairway shut, making it impossible to deploy in flight. Only when the aircraft slowed on approach or landed would the airflow decrease, allowing the stairway to operate normally. From 1972 onward, every Boeing 727 in service was retrofitted with this modification. Airlines had no choice. Federal regulators mandated it. The device remains a unique artifact of aviation history, a permanent reminder that one man, through a single leap, compelled the entire airline industry to rethink how its aircraft were secured. The Cooper vane wasn't just a technical fix. It became a symbol of how aviation safety evolves in response to audacious threats. Airports become fortresses. To understand the impact of the Cooper case, one must recall how casual and almost carefree air travel was in the United States prior to 1971. Airports were open spaces where families could walk to the gate to see loved ones off, and passengers boarded planes carrying bags, packages, and sometimes even weapons with little or no scrutiny. The concept of airport security as we know it today was virtually non-existent. This lax environment had already fueled a wave of hijackings in the 1960s and early 1970s, with some planes diverted to Cuba and others commandeered for ransom. But Cooper's escape crystallized the urgency for change. His crime wasn't just a hijacking. It was a demonstration of how easily a clever individual could exploit weak security measures. In response, sweeping reforms were rolled out across the country. Metal detectors were installed at boarding gates, and carry-on luggage was subjected to X-ray scanning. Federal sky marshals were deployed on select flights, and airlines began implementing rigorous identification checks. Flight crews underwent specialized training to handle hijacking scenarios, shifting from the assumption that hijackers merely wanted political asylum to recognizing that some might be violent criminals or opportunists. This cultural transformation reshaped the passenger experience. Where air travel had once been glamorous and relaxed, it was now tightly controlled, with security lines, checkpoints, and constant surveillance. The friendly skies became fortified skies. Although these changes were not caused by Cooper alone, his brazen leap into the darkness was one of the strongest catalysts for the new era of aviation security. Echoes in anti-terrorism regulations. As decades passed, the lessons of the Cooper hijacking echoed in broader policies aimed at combating terrorism. Regulators and lawmakers came to embrace a sobering philosophy. A single loophole, if left open, could bring down an entire system. Cooper proved it in 1971 with his parachute escape. Later generations of terrorists proved it with far deadlier tactics. When the September 11, 2001 attacks occurred, aviation experts often looked back and said, "It all began with Cooper." The measures taken after 9/11 reinforced cockpit doors, banned items, invasive passenger screenings, no-fly lists, and strict baggage restrictions were built on the same foundation that the Cooper case had laid 3 decades earlier. The recognition that security had to be proactive, not reactive. Today, as travelers shuffle through long security lines, remove their shoes, surrender liquids, and pass through full-body scanners, they are experiencing the ripple effects of that stormy night in November 1971. D.B. Cooper may have vanished without a trace, but his presence lingers in every airport terminal and every checkpoint. The mystery of his fate remains unsolved, yet his impact on aviation law and anti-terrorism measures is concrete, undeniable, and enduring. 7. The social climate and public psychology. An America in crisis of trust. The early 1970s were among the most unsettled years in American history. The Vietnam War dragged on with no clear victory in sight. and the mounting death toll weighed heavily on the nation's conscience. Anti-war demonstrations filled streets and college campuses, often clashing violently with police and the National Guard. For many young Americans, the war symbolized a government that was not only unresponsive, but also untrustworthy. At the same time, the economy faltered. Inflation surged, unemployment rose, and wages stagnated. Families felt squeezed, and the once assured promise of the American dream seemed to slip further out of reach. Political scandals further eroded confidence. Revelations about covert operations in Southeast Asia, combined with the growing shadow of what would soon become the Watergate scandal, painted the picture of an administration entangled in secrecy and deception. In this turbulent backdrop, the hijacking of Flight 305 was more than just a daring crime. It resonated as a cultural moment. To a society disillusioned with institutions, Cooper's act symbolized a direct challenge to authority. An almost poetic embodiment of rebellion at a time when ordinary citizens felt powerless. His leap into the stormy night seemed to capture the mood of a country defined by distrust, anger, and the faint but persistent hope that someone, somehow, could beat the system. Cooper, criminal or Robin Hood? What makes the D.B. Cooper case so unusual is not only the mystery of his disappearance, but also the striking public reaction. Hijackers of the era were usually reviled, feared, and condemned. Cooper, however, carved out a rare exception. Accounts from passengers and crew emphasized his composure. He was courteous, even gentlemanly, toward the stewardesses, and he never threatened passengers with unnecessary violence. His target was not the people, but the airline and its cash reserves. That distinction mattered. In a time of economic stress and political corruption, Americans found it easier to project their frustrations onto faceless corporations and bureaucracies than onto one enigmatic man. Cooper's crime, though unquestionably illegal, came across as a victimless strike against the system. The fact that he vanished so dramatically, parachuting into the night with no trace, only heightened the allure. It wasn't merely a theft, it was performance art, staged against the backdrop of a restless nation. Popular culture quickly transformed him into a folk anti-hero. Newspapers and television reports played up the mystery, while taverns and barber shops traded theories of where Cooper had gone. Comparisons to Robin Hood circulated, even though Cooper never redistributed his wealth. What mattered was the illusion. Here was a man who defied the government, outwitted the FBI, embarrassed a powerful airline, and walked away unscathed. For a public starved of trust in authority, that illusion was intoxicating, the enduring legend. Half a century later, the legend of D.B. Cooper endures, not only as a criminal mystery, but as a cultural touchstone. His name still surfaces whenever Americans debate themes of rebellion, mistrust of power, or the persistence of unsolved mysteries. Books, documentaries, and even songs continue to resurrect his story, often blurring the line between fact and myth. What keeps Cooper alive in the public imagination is not merely the question of his fate, but the symbolism he carries. He is at once a criminal who violated the law, a trickster who humiliated institutions, and a cipher onto which generations have projected their frustrations. He is both an outlaw and a cultural mirror, reflecting the uneasy relationship between the American people and their leaders. The paradox is inescapable. Cooper represents lawlessness, yet he is celebrated. He broke the rules, yet his defiance feels strangely honorable. This tension has allowed his legend to persist, where countless other hijackers have been forgotten. He remains suspended in the space between reality and folklore, neither fully villain nor fully hero, but an enigma whose leap into the darkness has echoed through American memory for over 50 years. 8. Popular culture, film and television, few true crime cases have exerted such gravitational pull on the imagination of filmmakers as the saga of D.B. Cooper. Hollywood recognized early that the story contained all the elements of a cinematic thriller: a mysterious stranger, a high-stakes crime, a daring escape, and an ending left deliberately unwritten. In 1981, The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper brought the myth to the big screen, dramatizing the notion that Cooper survived his leap and lived a life on the run. While critics debated the film's artistic merits, audiences were captivated by the sheer audacity of translating a real unsolved mystery into a swashbuckling chase narrative. Television, too, eagerly embraced Cooper's legend. In Prison Break, characters referenced him as the gold standard of escape artistry, the elusive benchmark no fugitive could ever quite surpass. Breaking Bad echoed his name when characters sought metaphors for vanishing without a trace, underlining Cooper's status as cultural shorthand for the impossible getaway. Even decades after the crime, screenwriters still leaned on his myth to signal cleverness, audacity, and enigma. Perhaps the most playful reinvention appeared in Marvel's Loki, 2021. In a tongue-in-cheek twist, the trickster god himself was revealed to have been masquerading as Cooper all along, vanishing with the money in a flash of divine mischief. The scene was brief but emblematic. Cooper had ascended from mere criminal suspect to a character in the pantheon of pop mythology, side by side with superheroes and gods, music, literature, and games. The hijacking also reverberated through music and literature. Rock, folk, and country musicians composed ballads about Cooper, portraying him alternately as a daring outlaw, a tragic wanderer, or a phantom slipping through history. These songs, often tinged with admiration, framed him less as a felon and more as a symbol of freedom, rebellion, and mystery. Novelists likewise found fertile ground in Cooper's unresolved fate. Crime thrillers imagined him adopting new identities, evading law enforcement and quietly living among unsuspecting communities. Some books leaned toward gritty realism, while others veered into speculative territory, suggesting Cooper became a spy, a drifter, or even a revolutionary figure abroad. The enduring absence of a definitive ending gave authors limitless creative license. Even video games have borrowed Cooper's silhouette. Developers have used the iconic image of a man in a dark suit, tie fluttering, leaping into a stormy night with a parachute. In this visual shorthand, players instantly recognize the association, the figure of mystery, risk, and freedom. For gamers, Cooper became less a historical criminal and more a symbol, an avatar of the ultimate gamble, where survival itself is the prize. The mysterious man archetype. Over the decades, Cooper ceased to be just a person and instead became an archetype. In popular imagination, he embodies the mysterious man, polite, calm under pressure, precise in action, and then gone without a trace. This archetype recurs endlessly in fiction: the enigmatic stranger in a bar, the thief who robs without cruelty, the drifter who leaves no footprint. Cooper's aura straddles the line between menace and magnetism, a figure who unsettles yet fascinates. What makes this archetype endure is its duality. On the one hand, Cooper is chilling, a man who committed a federal crime, endangered lives, and disappeared into darkness. On the other, he is alluring, disciplined, unflappable, and audacious enough to pull off what no one else dared. He embodies the fantasy of escaping not only the law, but also the ordinary constraints of life itself. Today, More than 50 years later, D.B. Cooper persists less as a historical individual and more as a ghostly presence in modern folklore. His story is retold in new media, reshaped by each generation, and reinterpreted through the lenses of art, entertainment, and myth. He is no longer just the hijacker of Flight 35. He is the eternal stranger who steps briefly into the spotlight, seizes attention, and vanishes forever, leaving behind only questions and legends. 9. The famous theories Cooper survived and escaped. Perhaps the most tantalizing possibility, the one that fuels endless fascination, is that D.B. Cooper actually made it. According to this theory, he was not a reckless daredevil, but a disciplined professional who knew exactly what he was doing. Advocates of this view point out that Cooper demanded specific conditions: a Boeing 727 with a rear staircase, a low cruising altitude, a slow speed, and even flaps deployed to stabilize the aircraft. These were not the random whims of an amateur. They were calculated requests. In this version of the story, Cooper parachuted safely into the wilderness, quickly discarded his suit and parachute, and vanished. Perhaps he had hidden clothes and supplies stashed in advance, or perhaps an accomplice was waiting to retrieve him by car. Believers in this theory imagine him adopting a new identity, blending into society, and living out the rest of his life quietly, maybe in small-town America, maybe abroad in South America or the Pacific. The notion that he outsmarted the FBI and lived undetected until his natural death is the ultimate perfect crime fantasy. Cooper died that stormy night. On the other end of the spectrum lies the grim interpretation that Cooper never survived his daring leap. The night of November 24, 1971, was brutal. Cold rain lashed the Pacific Northwest, winds howled at nearly 200 mph, and visibility was poor. Cooper wore only a business suit, loafers, and a thin raincoat, hardly the gear of a survivalist. He carried no helmet, no goggles, and no visible survival equipment. The terrain below was dense forest, rugged mountains, and frigid rivers. Many experts argue that even a seasoned paratrooper would have struggled under such conditions, especially with a reserve parachute that investigators later discovered had been sabotaged or unusable. They believe Cooper's jump was effectively a suicide mission, whether intentional or accidental. In this telling, Cooper's body lies somewhere in the vast wilderness, decomposed and undiscovered, his fate swallowed by the earth itself. Cooper as a soldier or pilot, a persistent and compelling theory, centers on Cooper's apparent expertise. He seemed to know the Boeing 727 intimately, requesting modifications that only someone with insider knowledge would think of. His instructions to the pilots, to fly low, slow, and with landing gear down, were textbook maneuvers for a parachute jump. This led investigators to suspect Cooper had a military or aviation background. Many have speculated he was a former paratrooper, perhaps from World War II or the Vietnam War, who repurposed his training for crime. Others suggest he may have been a pilot or even a disgruntled airline employee who resented the industry and used his insider knowledge to exploit it. The idea of a soldier-turned-outlaw adds a romantic, if unsettling, layer to his legend. The outlandish theories, as with any great mystery, the theories eventually spiraled into the bizarre. Some conspiracy-minded commentators claimed Cooper was a covert CIA agent on a classified mission gone wrong, or perhaps one gone exactly as planned, with the hijacking serving as a cover for something more secretive. Others leapt further into fantasy, proposing that Cooper was abducted by extraterrestrials mid-jump, explaining why no body or parachute was ever found. Such ideas drift into folklore more than criminology, but they illustrate just how far people will go to fill the vacuum left by unanswered questions. Meanwhile, dozens of self-proclaimed Coopers surfaced over the decades. Men on their deathbeds confessed to being the hijacker. Others sought book deals, television interviews, or simply a fleeting moment of fame. None of these claimants ever produced convincing evidence, and most were quickly debunked. Yet the very persistence of impersonators underscores how powerful the Cooper myth has become. People want to be him, even if only in story. The unresolved puzzle. In the end, no theory has been proven. Each has strengths and flaws, but none offers closure. Cooper remains suspended between survival and death, between soldier and outlaw, between man and myth. Perhaps that is why his story endures. The absence of a final answer keeps the legend alive, ensuring that every generation will revisit the question with fresh eyes. 10. Conclusion and historical meaning. The saga of D.B. Cooper occupies a unique and haunting place in American history. It is a paradox wrapped in mystery. The only unsolved airplane hijacking in the United States, a crime that transformed aviation security forever, and a cultural legend that refuses to fade. On one hand, it is a story of crime and danger. A man commandeered a passenger jet, threatened lives, and extorted a fortune. That should have been the end of it. A police report, an arrest, a trial. Yet Cooper's vanishing act altered everything. By parachuting into the storm and disappearing, he crossed the line from ordinary criminal to enduring myth. What lingers is not the theft of $200,000, but the audacity of escaping without leaving a trace. This is what makes the case so unnerving. In an age that prides itself on surveillance, databases, and airtight law enforcement, the thought that a man could simply vanish into thin air seems impossible. Cooper's leap mocks our faith in order and control. It is a reminder that even in a world governed by rules and records, uncertainty still exists and sometimes triumphs. But the Cooper case is not merely about one man's disappearance. It reflects the broader anxieties of America in the 1970s, a nation disillusioned by the Vietnam War, shaken by inflation, and scarred by political corruption. Found in Cooper a strange mirror of its own unrest. He was an outlaw who seemed polite, almost gentlemanly, targeting corporations rather than individuals. To many, he embodied defiance against a system that felt broken. More than 50 years later, Cooper endures. He is at once an unsolved riddle, a puzzle that mocks investigators and fascinates the public, a cultural symbol appearing in films, songs, novels, and television as shorthand for mystery and rebellion, a ghost of history, reminding us that not all stories can be closed, not all questions can be answered. The legend of D.B. Cooper teaches us something essential about human curiosity. We are drawn to the unknown, to the space between certainty and doubt. Cooper lives on in that space, not only as a man who vanished into the night, but as a permanent figure in the imagination, where fact blurs into folklore, and history leaves behind an unfinished sentence.